Imagine this. It's 4 in the morning in Pennsylvania, a quiet little island sitting in the middle of the Susquehanna River. Inside of your control room, red lights start flashing, alarms are screaming, and no one really knows why. What started as a tiny mechanical glitch, just a single valve stuck open, would spiral into the most terrifying nuclear accident in American history. Within hours, a reactor began overheating, confusion spread through the control room, and a hydrogen bubble inside the core sparked fears of an explosion that could have wiped out entire towns. News cameras swarmed, families packed their cars, and suddenly, the future of nuclear power, saw in something once seen as clean, limitless energy, was hanging by a thread. And here's the wild part. No one really understood what was happening, not even the people in charge. This is the story of 3 Mile Island, the day America realized just how thin the line is between control and chaos. A stuck valve, a cascade of human errors, and a moment that changed nuclear power forever. Stick around, because what really happened inside that control room and how it reshaped an entire nation's trust in technology is something you'll never forget. It's 4 o'clock in the morning in Pennsylvania. The world outside is quiet, but inside the control room of the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant, it's chaos. Alarms are blaring, red lights flashing across the panels, and operators are frantically scanning gauges trying to make sense of what's going wrong. Pressure levels are dropping, the temperature's climbing, and something feels off. Then it happens. A single valve about the size of your fist gets stuck open. One tiny mechanical failure. Nothing dramatic, no explosion, no warning, just a small piece of metal refusing to close. But that tiny failure sets off a chain reaction, one that spirals completely out of control. As steam starts hissing through pipes and the control room fills with alarm tones, the people in charge, trained, skilled, confident, suddenly realize they don't actually know what's happening inside the reactor. The instruments are confusing, the warnings don't make sense, and every decision seems to make things worse. Within hours, a nuclear reactor begins overheating. Radiation starts leaking, and no one, not the operators, not the company, not even the US government, can say for sure how bad it really is. Meanwhile, outside the plant, the news spreads like wildfire. Reporters flood the area, helicopters circle above, and frightened families start packing their cars to get out of town. For millions of Americans, the word nuclear suddenly doesn't mean progress. It means danger. And here's the craziest part. All of it started with a single stuck valve, a small mistake magnified by confusion, panic, and a system that wasn't designed to handle human error. The 3 Mile Island accident wasn't just an engineering failure, it was a wake-up call, a moment when America realized that nuclear power, the very symbol of modern progress, could also turn into a nightmare overnight. This is the story of how one quiet morning turned into the world's most famous nuclear scare, a story of alarms, confusion, fear, and the lessons that changed the future of nuclear energy forever. So grab your coffee because once we step inside that control room, you'll see just how quickly control can slip away and how a single human mistake almost rewrote America's history. To really understand why 3 Mile Island shook the nation, you've got to rewind a bit, back to the 1970s. America was obsessed with the idea of progress. Computers were just starting to appear in offices, color TVs were everywhere, and the country was racing toward a high-tech future. But there was one big problem: energy. The oil crisis of the early 70s had hit hard. Gas prices were skyrocketing. Lines at fuel stations stretched for blocks, and people were starting to realize just how dependent the US was on imported oil. Everyone, from scientists to politicians, was searching for a way out, and that's where nuclear power came in. It wasn't just energy, it was a symbol of hope. Clean, modern, efficient, no smoke, no smog, no endless barrels of oil. Just atoms, splitting quietly, producing enough electricity to power entire cities. At the time, nuclear energy was seen almost like science fiction come true. The government called it too cheap to meter. Engineers said it was the future of power. By the mid-1970s, America had over 70 nuclear plants running or being built. 3 Mile Island, a pair of reactors on a small island in the Susquehanna River near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, was supposed to be one of the best examples. Brand new, high-tech, safe. Unit 2, the reactor that would later make headlines, had only been running for a few months when everything went wrong. But here's the twist. While engineers and politicians were celebrating, not everyone felt safe. Outside the power plants, a growing anti-nuclear movement was taking shape. Environmentalists warned that one mistake could be catastrophic. Hollywood even released a movie called The China Syndrome about a fictional nuclear meltdown, just 12 days before the real accident at 3 Mile Island. Talk about timing. So on one hand, you had optimism, the belief that science could fix anything. On the other hand, there was fear that maybe, just maybe, we were playing with forces we didn't fully understand. And that's the world 3 Mile Island was born into. A nation balancing excitement and anxiety, trust and doubt, innovation and risk. Nobody expected that balance to tip. But in March of 1979, one small glitch inside that plant would do exactly that. It would take just a few hours for the dream of limitless nuclear energy to turn into one of America's biggest what-if moments. It's the early hours of March 28, 1979. Most of Pennsylvania is still asleep. The streets are quiet, the river misty, and the world feels calm. But inside the control room of the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant, things are about to go from routine to disaster in a matter of minutes. At 4 a.m., the plant's Unit 2 reactor was running as usual, a normal shift, nothing out of the ordinary. Then suddenly one of the feed water pumps, basically the part that sends water into the reactor to keep it cool, stops working. It's a small glitch, something that shouldn't be catastrophic. The system is designed to handle it. When that pump fails, the temperature and pressure inside the reactor begin to rise. To relieve the pressure, a pressure-operated relief valve, known as the PORV, automatically opens, allowing steam to escape. That's exactly what it's supposed to do. But here's where everything starts going wrong. When the pressure drops back to normal, that valve doesn't close. It's stuck open. Steam and cooling water keep leaking out, but the instruments inside the control room make it look like the valve did close. The operators can't see what's really happening. Imagine trying to drive a car where the dashboard lights are lying to you. That's what these engineers were dealing with. Over the next few minutes, the situation quietly gets worse. Hot steam keeps escaping. The coolant, the lifeblood of the reactor, is draining away, and the core inside is getting hotter and hotter. But in the control room, the readings seem to suggest the opposite, that there's too much water, not too little. So what do the operators do? They react logically based on what they see. They start reducing the amount of cooling water being pumped in, thinking they're preventing an overflow. In reality, they're starving the reactor of the one thing it desperately needs: coolant. Within minutes, the temperature soars, pressure readings bounce around, alarms are blaring nonstop, dozens at once, flashing red lights everywhere. It's sensory overload. Nobody can tell which warning is serious and which one is just a system echoing the chaos. The irony here is painful. The more they try to fix the problem, the worse it gets. At around 4:30 a.m., the reactor automatically shuts down. The nuclear reaction itself stops, but that doesn't mean it's safe. The uranium fuel rods inside are still generating enormous amounts of heat, what's called decay heat. Without enough water to carry that heat away, the core begins to overheat. The operators, exhausted and confused, are staring at a wall of gauges, each telling a different story. They don't realize that deep inside the reactor vessel, the fuel rods are now starting to warp and melt. And outside the control room, nobody knows a thing. The plant is sealed, quiet, still glowing under its own lights. Just another night shift in a power station. But beneath that calm surface, a hidden chain reaction has already started. By dawn, radiation levels inside the plant begin to rise. A faint metallic smell creeps through some areas. And yet, for the men in that control room, it still doesn't feel like a full-blown emergency. They think they're in control, but in truth, they're already in the middle of the worst nuclear accident in American history. The next few hours inside the 3 Mile Island control room were pure chaos. Picture this. You're standing in a room filled with hundreds of switches, lights, and gauges, each one flashing and beeping. Alarms are screaming from every direction, warning of pressure changes, temperature spikes, low coolant levels, high coolant levels, all at once. It's like standing in front of an airplane cockpit where every light has suddenly gone red. That was the reality for the operators on duty that morning. By now, the pressure valve, that tiny piece of equipment that started all of this, is still stuck open, but the control panel shows it as closed. The team believes the reactor is flooded with too much water. They don't realize that the core is actually starving, running dangerously low on coolant. And this is where things spiral. The operators trying to stabilize the system make what they think are smart moves. They reduce the flow of cooling water even more. They're not panicking. They're following the readings in front of them. The problem? Those readings are lying. The instruments were never designed to tell them that the valve was jammed. Inside the reactor, the water level keeps dropping. The fuel rods, the heart of the reactor, start heating up fast. The zirconium coating on them begins to react with the steam, producing hydrogen gas, which builds up pressure inside the system. But in the control room, it's impossible to see any of that happening. And here's what makes this even scarier. The alarms never stop. The operators are trying to interpret dozens of warnings, many of which contradict each other. Some lights flash constantly, others flicker and go dark. It's total sensory overload. One of the engineers later said it felt like trying to solve a puzzle that keeps changing while the clock is ticking. The human brain just isn't built to process that kind of chaos. These men weren't untrained, they were following their procedures. But those procedures were based on an assumption that instruments don't lie. The system was built with layers of automation, but no one had imagined what would happen if both the machine and the human misunderstood each other at the same time. Minutes turn into hours. The control room is thick with tension. Operators are arguing over what's happening. Some think the reactor's fine. Others are sure it's overheating. Nobody has a complete picture. Meanwhile, inside the reactor, the situation is getting critical. The core's temperature is climbing so high that some of the fuel rods are starting to melt. This is what experts call a partial meltdown, but no one in that room knows it yet. They're flying blind, trapped between false readings, outdated manuals, and a storm of alarms that won't stop. Then, around 6 a.m., someone finally notices something strange, a sudden spike in radiation inside the building. It's the first real sign that something is seriously wrong. They begin venting steam to relieve pressure, which sends small amounts of radioactive gas into the atmosphere. At that moment, what started as a small technical issue has become a full-blown nuclear crisis. Yet inside the plant, they're still piecing it together. There's no explosion, no fireball, no dramatic event that tells them they've lost control. It's quiet, almost deceptively so. Just a room full of exhausted engineers trying to make sense of chaos in blinking lights and screaming alarms. By the time the sun rises over Harrisburg, the operators finally shut down the systems they think are causing the issue. The alarms slowly fade, the room calms down, but the damage has already been done. Deep inside the reactor, the core is partially melted, and radioactive gases are beginning to leak. They've stopped the noise, but not the danger. And outside the plant, the first signs of trouble are about to reach the public. While the operators inside the 3 Mile Island plant were scrambling to understand what went wrong, the world outside was about to find out, and panic was only a phone call away. Early that morning, officials at the plant finally notified local authorities that there had been a minor technical problem. That's the phrase they used, minor. They said everything was under control, no danger to the public, nothing to worry about. But within hours, the story started to spread, and it didn't sound minor anymore. Radio stations began reporting that there'd been an incident at a nuclear plant near Harrisburg. Some broadcasters used words like radiation leak. Others said the reactor had malfunctioned. Nobody had clear information, and each report sounded scarier than the last. Imagine hearing that on your car radio while driving your kids to school. A radiation leak? At a nuclear plant, just a few miles away, people began calling each other, schools started closing early, and the roads leading out of Harrisburg filled with cars. Some families didn't even pack. They just left. And the worst part? The people in charge of giving answers didn't have any. Metropolitan Edison, Jacques, owned the company that ran the plant, kept insisting that things were stable, even as radiation detectors inside the facility showed rising levels. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the NRC, tried to step in, but communication between the company, the state, and federal officials was slow, inconsistent, and sometimes completely contradictory. Reporters started arriving by the dozens, then hundreds. News vans, satellite trucks, helicopters. Every major network wanted a shot of that nuclear plant on the river. The story was no longer local. It was national. And with the cameras came chaos. At press conferences, officials tried to calm the public, but every vague answer only made people more nervous. One spokesman said there was a small release of radiation. Another said it was insignificant, but nobody defined what small or insignificant actually meant. To the average person, it sounded like code for, "We're not telling you everything." Local residents began to feel trapped in an invisible crisis. You couldn't see radiation. You couldn't smell it. You couldn't hear it. But you couldn't stop imagining it either. Rumors exploded. Some said the reactor had already melted down. Others claimed a massive explosion was imminent. By the third day, the tension was unbearable. Then on March 30th, 2 days after the incident began, Pennsylvania's governor, Dick Thornburgh, made a public announcement. He advised pregnant women and small children within a 5-mile radius of the plant to evacuate, just in case. That single phrase, just in case, sent shockwaves through the region. Thousands more people packed up and left. Highways jammed with cars. Store shelves emptied. The air was thick with uncertainty. Nobody knew what was real anymore. Reporters were broadcasting live from every corner, and each new rumor, each shaky quote from an unnamed source, made headlines. For a few terrifying days, it felt like America was living inside a nuclear thriller. And the irony? Inside the plan, the situation had actually stabilized somewhat. The reactor was still damaged, but not exploding. The radiation releases, while real, were limited. But that information didn't reach the public fast enough. Fear had already taken over. 3 Mile Island had become more than an accident. It had become a symbol of something deeper. A reminder that when people lose trust in those in charge, panic can spread faster than any radioactive gas ever could. And while officials scrambled to regain control of the message, the federal government was finally stepping in to take control of the crisis itself. While the people of Pennsylvania were packing their cars and the media was flooding the airwaves with speculation, the federal government was finally stepping into the chaos. By this point, just a few days after the incident began, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, or NRC, realized this wasn't just a small technical hiccup. It was the most serious nuclear accident in American history, and everyone was looking at them for answers. But here's the problem. The NRC didn't have a clear picture either. Inside their Washington offices, phone lines were jammed. The information coming from the plant was confusing and often contradictory. One minute, reports said the situation was improving. The next minute, someone was warning that the reactor core might still be overheating. Imagine trying to piece together a puzzle, but half the pieces are missing, and the rest are constantly changing shape. That's exactly what the NRC was dealing with. So the federal government did something bold. They decided to take control directly. President Jimmy Carter, who by the way was a trained nuclear engineer before becoming president, personally got involved. Carter understood the science behind what was happening. He also understood something even more important: the psychology of fear. The country was on edge, the media was out of control, and people had lost trust in official statements. So he knew that just talking about safety wasn't enough. People needed to see leadership. On April 1st, 1979, President Carter and First Lady Rosalind Carter flew to Pennsylvania and visited the 3 Mile Island site themselves. Think about that for a second. The President of the United States walking into what people thought might be a radioactive danger zone. Cameras followed him as he shook hands with workers, toured the facility, and calmly addressed reporters. That image, Carter standing just miles from the damaged reactor, became a defining moment. It sent a powerful message. If the president isn't afraid to be here, maybe we shouldn't be either. But behind the scenes, things were still far from calm. Engineers were running nonstop to cool the reactor and prevent any further release of radiation. NRC officials were analyzing every reading, every pressure level, every temperature spike, trying to confirm that the core was stable. The biggest fear at that point? A hydrogen bubble inside the reactor's containment vessel. Scientists worried it could ignite or explode, which, if it happened, could potentially rupture the containment and release even more radiation. For a few tense hours, experts debated whether that bubble posed an actual explosion risk. Television networks ran with the story, hydrogen bubble could explode, splashed across screens nationwide. People imagined a nuclear bomb going off in Pennsylvania, but after intense analysis, the NRC confirmed the bubble wouldn't explode. It didn't have the right conditions for ignition. That announcement finally started to calm nerves. Over the following days, a clearer picture emerged. The reactor's core had partially melted, about half of it, but it was contained. The cooling system was restored, radiation levels dropped, and by the first week of April, the immediate crisis was over. No one was killed, no one suffered radiation injuries. But politically, the fallout was massive. The NRC was criticized for slow, confusing communication. The plant's operator, Metropolitan Edison, was accused of downplaying the seriousness of the situation. And state officials were furious that they hadn't received timely or accurate information when they needed it most. The federal government launched multiple investigations. President Carter ordered a full review of the accident, not just to find out what went wrong, but to make sure it never happened again. What they discovered was eye-opening. The accident wasn't caused by one big failure. It was a chain reaction of small ones. A stuck valve, a misleading indicator, human error, miscommunication, poor training, and that chain revealed a deeper truth. Nuclear energy wasn't just a matter of technology, it was a matter of trust, clarity, and control. In the end, the government's response, especially Carter's visit, helped calm the public and bring an end to the panic. But it also exposed a harsh reality. America's nuclear system wasn't nearly as fail-safe as everyone had believed. 3 Mile Island didn't just test the strength of a reactor, it tested the strength of a government's ability to respond, under pressure, under scrutiny, and under fear. And from that moment on, the rules of nuclear power in America would never be the same again. All right, so here's where we slow down for a second and unpack what actually went wrong inside the reactor that morning. Because the 3 Mile Island accident wasn't caused by one big explosion or some dramatic failure. It was a chain reaction of small problems that just kept snowballing. So picture this. It's the early morning of March 28, 1979, at the 3 Mile Island Nuclear Generating Station in Pennsylvania. The plant had two reactors, Unit 1 and Unit 2. Unit 2 was running that night, generating electricity for hundreds of thousands of homes. Everything seemed normal, until suddenly it wasn't. At 4 a.m., a minor malfunction started it all. In the secondary cooling system, the part that carries heat away from the reactor, a pump stopped working. This might sound small, but that pump's job was critical. Without it, the reactor's heat couldn't escape as efficiently, and pressure began to build. To relieve that pressure, a safety valve automatically opened, which was normal. The valve was supposed to open briefly, release steam, then close again once the pressure dropped. But here's the twist. The valve didn't close. It got stuck open, and hot coolant water started leaking out. Inside the control room, there was a light on the operator's panel that seemed to indicate the valve had closed, but it didn't actually show the valve's position. It only showed that the signal to close had been sent. So, to the operators, everything looked fine. In reality, radioactive water was still escaping from the reactor into a holding tank, and the core was slowly being deprived of the coolant it desperately needed to stay covered and cool. As water levels dropped, the temperature inside the reactor began to rise. Steam pockets formed where water should have been. Pressure readings became confusing. Alarms were flashing everywhere, dozens at once, and the operators couldn't tell which ones were critical and which were just side effects. Imagine trying to fly a plane while every warning light on the dashboard starts blinking at once. That's what it was like inside that control room. The crew thought the reactor had too much water, not too little. So, in an effort to fix what they believed was the problem, they shut off the emergency cooling system, the very system that was designed to prevent the core from overheating. They did it because they thought they were helping, but it was the exact opposite of what the reactor needed. Without enough cooling water, the reactor core, the heart of the system, where the nuclear fuel sits, began to overheat. Within hours, the temperature soared high enough to damage the uranium fuel rods. The metal casings started to crack and release radioactive gases. This was now a partial meltdown. About half of the reactor's core was exposed and damaged, but luckily it didn't melt all the way through the containment structure. That's the key difference between 3 Mile Island and disasters like Chernobyl. The containment building at TM1 actually did its job. It held. Still, the pressure and heat were extreme. The operators worked desperately to figure out what was happening. Remember, this was 1979. No digital displays, no computer simulations, just analog dials, flashing lights, and human judgment. At one point, steam built up so much that it pushed radioactive gases into the plant's auxiliary building. Some of those gases, mostly xenon and krypton, both inert and short-lived, were released into the atmosphere in small amounts. The good news? Those radiation levels were far below anything deadly. The bad news? No one outside the plant knew that yet. By the time engineers finally realized that the cooling system had been mistakenly shut off and that the valve had been open the whole time, the damage had already been done. They reactivated the emergency pumps and started flooding the core with water again. Over the next several hours, the temperature began to drop. The reactor was finally cooling down. In simple terms, here's what happened. A pump failed, a valve got stuck open, indicators misled operators. The cooling system was shut off by mistake. The core overheated, causing a partial meltdown. Each of those steps alone was manageable, but together they formed the perfect storm. The craziest part? Every one of those failures was humanly understandable. None of them were wild acts of negligence or sabotage. Just ordinary people trying to make sense of bad data in a high-stress situation. It was the kind of mistake that showed how fragile even the most advanced systems can be when design flaws, equipment errors, and human confusion all collide. When experts later studied the accident, they said it perfectly. The technology worked, but the people didn't have the right information. And that simple truth, that gap between what machines know and what humans understand, is what made 3 Mile Island not just a technical failure, but a deeply human one. The next question everyone wanted to know was, how did this private disaster inside a power plant turn into a national panic? Well, that's when the story leaves the control room and explodes into headlines, fear, and chaos. When the dust finally settled over 3 Mile Island, the fear didn't just disappear overnight. The crisis was over. But the cleanup had only just begun. By April 1979, the reactor at Unit 2 was safely shut down and stable. The immediate danger had passed. But what remained inside that containment building was a mess unlike anything America had ever faced. Think about it. The core, the heart of the reactor, had partially melted. Hundreds of thousands of gallons of radioactive water filled the basement. The walls were contaminated. Every piece of equipment, every pipe, every bolt had to be inspected, measured, and decontaminated. And you couldn't just send in a cleaning crew with mops and buckets. This was radioactive. You had to plan every move, every breath, every tool, carefully, safely, scientifically. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission, NRC, and the Department of Energy teamed up with engineers and scientists from across the country to figure out how to clean up a partially melted nuclear reactor. No one had ever done it before. Step one was cooling and stabilizing the damaged reactor core completely, making sure no more heat or radioactive gases were escaping. Once that was under control, workers had to deal with the radioactive water. There were about 2.3 million gallons of it. That's enough to fill over 3 Olympic-sized swimming pools. The water had to be filtered, treated, and stored safely, all while workers were wearing protective suits and breathing through masks. It took years to drain, clean, and process that water safely. Then came the core itself. Using remote-controlled robots and cameras, workers began inspecting the inside of the reactor. What they saw was shocking. Melted fuel rods, warped metal, and debris piled at the bottom of the reactor vessel. They couldn't just scoop it up and throw it away. Each piece had to be cut, lifted, and packaged and shipped to specialized storage facilities under strict supervision. The process was painstaking, like performing surgery through a telescope. Every move was slow, deliberate, and closely monitored. The cleanup operation lasted over 14 years, from 1979 until 1993, and cost nearly $1 billion. That's about $2 billion in today's money. Thousands of workers cycled through the site over that decade and a half, carefully dismantling and decontaminating the damaged systems. In 1993, the NRC officially declared the cleanup complete. The Unit 2 reactor was fully defueled and placed into a state known as post-defueling monitored storage. Basically, it was shut down forever, but continuously monitored to make sure everything stayed stable. The undamaged Unit 1 reactor, however, was restarted in 1985 after major safety improvements and operated safely for decades after that. It eventually shut down in 2019, marking the official end of the 3 Mile Island power plant story. And here's something important to understand. Throughout the entire cleanup, no one died from radiation exposure, and no long-term health effects were ever proven in the surrounding population. That's not to say people weren't scared. They absolutely were. Many residents remained skeptical for years, wondering if they'd been told the full truth. Some lawsuits were filed, but multiple scientific studies, including ones from the National Cancer Institute, found no increase in cancer rates or health problems linked to the accident. So on paper, the cleanup was a success, but emotionally and politically, the scar it left was deep. For years, the words 3 Mile Island became shorthand for danger, for the idea that nuclear power, no matter how safe it looks, could go wrong in a heartbeat. The workers who cleaned that plant rarely made headlines, but in many ways they were the quiet heroes, the ones who turned a disaster zone back into a safe site. Day after day, year after year, they showed up, suited up, and did the impossible, undoing a nuclear accident, piece by radioactive piece. By the time it was all over, America had learned a powerful lesson. You can recover from a nuclear accident, but it takes time, discipline, and a lot of trust rebuilt one step at a time. The meltdown was contained. The plant was cleaned. The science worked. But the world would never look at nuclear energy the same way again. After the alarms stopped ringing and the cleanup teams packed up their gear, the real shockwave of 3 Mile Island wasn't the radiation. It was the fear and distrust that spread across the entire country. For the first time, millions of Americans looked at nuclear power, this clean, futuristic energy, and started asking hard questions. If one small valve can cause all that chaos, how safe is this, really? Before 1979, nuclear energy was booming. Dozens of new plants were being built across the U.S., promising cheap, efficient power and freedom from oil dependence. People saw nuclear power as the future, almost like magic science at work. But after 3 Mile Island, that optimism cracked wide open. Overnight, public confidence collapsed. Polls showed a massive drop in support for nuclear energy. People didn't just fear the technology, they feared the people running it. They didn't trust the industry, the government, or the information being given to them. The phrase, "it's under control," once meant to reassure, now sounded like a cover-up. And that shift in public perception changed everything. For one, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, or NRC, completely overhauled its safety regulations. Before the accident, the NRC mostly focused on plant design, making sure the machinery and systems were up to standard. But after 3 Mile Island, the focus moved sharply toward human factors: training, communication, and emergency response. They realized that even the best machines in the world can fail if the humans operating them don't have the right tools, procedures, and information. So the NRC introduced stricter operator training programs. Control room staff had to go through advanced simulation exercises, basically practicing disaster scenarios in nuclear flight simulators. Plants were also required to upgrade their control panels to be more intuitive. Fewer confusing indicators, better alarms, clearer readouts. The human-machine relationship had to be rebuilt from the ground up. Another huge change was emergency planning. Before 3 Mile Island, there wasn't a solid, standardized system for how local, state, and federal agencies should respond to a nuclear accident. During the crisis, that lack of coordination created chaos. So afterward, the government made sure that never happened again. They set up emergency preparedness plans that included evacuation routes, public alert systems, and designated response teams trained specifically for nuclear incidents. Every plant had to coordinate with state and local governments. No more leaving the community in the dark. In 1980, the Kameny Commission, a special panel appointed by President Jimmy Carter, released its report on the accident. It concluded that the real cause wasn't just mechanical failure, but human failure and communication breakdowns. It called for a fundamental change in attitudes, both in the nuclear industry and in its regulators. That report became the blueprint for reforming America's nuclear safety culture. And perhaps one of the biggest legacies of 3 Mile Island was the creation of the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations, or INPO, in 1979. This was an industry-led group designed to hold every nuclear operator in the country to the highest safety standards, even stricter than what the government required. If one plant made a mistake, every plant was expected to learn from it. No exceptions. It was a way of saying never again. But while all of these technical and policy changes made nuclear power much safer, they couldn't repair the public's shaken confidence. For many Americans, the words 3 Mile Island became synonymous with nuclear danger. Protests erupted across the country. In New York City, over 200,000 people marched in 1979 demanding an end to nuclear power. Environmental groups gained momentum, and the media continued to spotlight nuclear risks. The result? Construction of new nuclear plants in the U.S. virtually stopped. More than 100 planned reactors were canceled in the years that followed. Investors pulled back, politicians grew cautious, and nuclear energy's bright future dimmed almost overnight. It took decades for the industry to even begin to recover, and some would argue it never fully did. But on the flip side, 3 Mile Island made the plants that did survive much safer. It forced everyone, from engineers to regulators to politicians, to confront the uncomfortable truth. Safety isn't a checkbox, it's a mindset. So while the accident scared America, it also redefined what safe meant in the nuclear world. Every warning system, every operator test, every emergency siren that exists today traces its roots back to those 6 chaotic days in March 1979. 3 Mile Island didn't end nuclear power. It changed it forever. And in a strange way, that disaster may have saved countless lives in the decades that followed by forcing an entire industry to grow up. Because sometimes the wake-up call you fear the most is the one you need the most. So what can we take away from 3 Mile Island? Beyond the alarms, the chaos, and the headlines, there are some lessons that still matter today, not just for nuclear power, but for how we handle any complex technology. First, technology is only as good as the people who operate it. The reactor's safety systems were advanced, the design was solid, but the human operators didn't have the full picture. Small mistakes, a stuck valve, misread gauges, assumptions made in the heat of the moment, turned a manageable problem into a partial meltdown. That's a reminder for all of us. No matter how smart a system is, communication, training, and understanding are just as important as the machines themselves. Second, transparency matters. Public trust is fragile. During the accident, conflicting messages and slow communication made people panic. Officials and companies can have the best intentions, but if the information isn't clear, fear spreads faster than facts. Today, whether it's nuclear power, medicine, or technology, being open and honest with the public is critical. Third, preparedness is everything. After the accident, the NRC and industry completely overhauled training, control systems, and emergency protocols. They realized it wasn't enough to hope nothing goes wrong. You have to plan for the worst, practice for the worst, and make sure every possible scenario is accounted for. That lesson still applies, whether in engineering, government, or even personal life. Fourth, small errors can have huge consequences. It wasn't a massive explosion, a hacker, or a terrorist that caused the meltdown. It was a combination of tiny mechanical failures and human decisions. That teaches us humility. In any complex system, small details matter, and oversight can be the difference between control and crisis. And finally, resilience is possible. Despite the meltdown, the cleanup succeeded, no one died, and future reactors became safer. The accident didn't destroy the entire nuclear industry, but it forced it to evolve. Sometimes, a crisis isn't just about loss. It's about learning, growing, and coming back stronger. 3 Mile Island may have been terrifying, but it also became a turning point. It exposed vulnerabilities, challenged assumptions, and pushed America to think harder about safety, responsibility, and trust. In the end, the story isn't just about a valve that got stuck. It's about people, technology, and the balance between them. It's about understanding that even the most advanced systems need constant vigilance, constant care, and constant learning. And maybe that's the biggest lesson of all. Progress isn't just about building amazing technology. It's about making sure we can handle it when things go wrong. Because in moments of crisis, what really matters isn't just the machines or the alarms. It's the people, the decisions, and the trust that keeps everything from spinning completely out of control.